Time for another episode of Sofa Unboxing. This box should probably give away what camera I ended up going with. Let's take a look inside. Just kidding, I actually already unboxed it and I'm now charging the battery. So yeah, I bought the Canon EOS R. In fact, I'm filming on it right now, and so far, I really like it. In this video, we're going to be talking about why I bought this camera, what I like about it, and why I think it's probably my perfect camera. I'm a big believer in investing in good gear that you've properly researched if it will make your work easier, as then it will most likely pay for itself. When it comes to cameras, I've always tried to use the best tool for the job without getting too sucked in by gimmicks or flashy specs I know I'll rarely use, and I've mostly stuck to this. But there have been a few exceptions. And unfortunately, my last one, the Panasonic G7, great camera by the way, just not that useful for me, was one of those situations. But it wasn't the specs or the gimmicks that drew me into the GH5. No, this was something completely different. This is my first proper camera, the Panasonic G7, that I personally got because it shot 4K and wasn't too expensive. I used the hell out of this thing, and I genuinely loved filming with it. In many ways, the Panasonic G7 was the first camera I ever had that actually taught me to strive for a bit more when I'm filming. I'd already made home movies, I started doing that when I was like 9, I think. But this was the first camera I ever did any color grading for, first camera I ever bought any lights for, took this thing to several different countries. I simply used it a lot until one fateful review. Back in 2018, I was shooting my review for the Beats Solo 3s. Now, halfway through the shooting process of making that video, I was just cycling through my clips, seeing what I'd shot so far, and then the screen went black. And just like that, my camera was broken. Now, don't get me wrong, I had close calls with the G7 before, but unfortunately, at this moment in September 2018, this was the end of my trusty Panasonic G7. So then I was tasked with finding a new camera, and I almost immediately bought another G7, but then I remembered about the Sony a6300, but as it would turn out, that had an overheating problem, so instead, I opted to go for the Sony a6500. And I've never regretted a camera purchase more. Put simply, this camera just irritated me. Sure, I could get a nice image, but the fiddly buttons, bad quality 1080p, and other more serious issues later on made making videos clunky and kind of difficult. Eventually, one day while it was getting fixed, I opted to buy a Canon 70D just so I could make videos while it was getting repaired. Already had some Canon lenses, way cheaper than renting. It just seemed like a good decision. And in the end, despite the poor quality 1080p, terrible slow motion, and noisy low light, I really liked this camera. The autofocus was like nothing I'd ever used before, and the hype around the Canon colors was very real. I used that for a little while until eventually I was faced with the decision of buying a new camera, and so seeing as I'd enjoyed the 70D so much, I planned on buying the EOS R. However, when I went to go buy it, it was two things, very difficult to find and very expensive. So in the end, I decided to look for other options. It was at this point where I remembered the Panasonic GH5. I'd already spent 2.5 years with the G7, and I really liked that. So if I could have that with more professional features, then why not? Nevertheless, I ended up buying it and I used it up until a couple of days ago. Gotta say, it was mostly great. However, it had features that I didn't use and lacked features that I wanted. So in the end, I decided it'd be best if I looked for something else. So when looking for this new camera, I had a few things to consider, namely image quality, ease of use, full frame, and of course, the ability to stand up to some serious work in post. Immediately, there were two clear options, Sony a7 III and of course the EOS R. Now, I was willing to try Sony again. The uncropped full frame 4K, which is actually a downsampled 6K image, does look amazing. But after seeing the 1080p and the pixel quality of the a7 III, as well as remembering the difficulties I had with the codec, I decided against it. So in comes the EOS R. So why the EOS R when the a7 III has uncropped 4K full frame and 120 FPS in 1080p? To be honest, after shooting Micro Four Thirds for 3.5 years, crops really don't bother me that much. And as for the 120 FPS, I actually prefer shooting 60 FPS. And the 60 FPS on the Canon is a lot better than it is with the Sony. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about what I've enjoyed with the EOS R, but instead of doing it in here, I think we should probably go outside. First off, I love the full frame look. This is technically my first full frame camera, and I really like the look it gives off with the shallow depth of field and the wide angles I've never been able to pull off before. It also allows me to get that shallow depth of field a lot easier than when I was on Micro Four Thirds. Don't get me wrong, I could get it, but this would usually involve some very fast primes, which weren't all that convenient if I only wanted to bring one lens. Low light is also significantly better, and overall, I've really been enjoying this sensor. The next thing that I really like about the EOS R is the autofocus. Canon's dual pixel autofocus really does just look incredible. I've had it before on the Canon 70D, and that was one of my favorite things about it. It just has a look about it that makes it look like someone's manually pulling focus. And for what I do, shooting tech, that actually sped up the production of that MacBook review I just did very significantly. Moving on, we have the 1080p quality and codecs. And one of the things I like most about this camera is the 1080p quality. When set up properly, because it is important to make sure that you set up your camera properly, I could pretty much cut seamlessly between 1080p and 4K footage, which is quite incredible. And so far, I haven't been able to do this on any other camera. Now, this is partially due to the codecs, which I also love, because with this camera, you actually get an all-eye codec. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially a super uncompressed codec that does result in a massive file size. This is especially true in 4K because you got like a 480 megabits record rate, but it's a lot kinder on your system, and it also means that each pixel has more data to work with, so you do get a more detailed image. It also means that you can do more in post, and so while the file size can be a bit of an inconvenience, in my opinion, for my workflow, it's definitely worth it. Up next, we have pixel quality. Now, this is the other reason that the image from this camera looks so good, because not all resolutions are created to the same quality. Some 1080p or 4K will look better than others. A good example of this is the Canon C100 Mark II, which actually has a really great image, but very lackluster specs. And I think this is very much the case with the EOS R. Each pixel has a good amount of detail and can hold up to a nice level of grading if shot correctly. So yeah, I personally really like the pixel quality out of this camera. The next thing I want to talk about is color science. Now, I know at this point, Canon colors have very much become a little bit of a buzzword. That said, you set this thing up right and you will be able to get some amazing colors out of this thing. Now, me personally, my two favorite color profiles are of course C-Log, but I also really like the Faithful profile. I know a lot of people shoot natural, but if you're a Canon shooter and you've never tried the Faithful profile, it's basically the same as natural, but I have found the highlights to look a little bit nicer. Canon colors actually get their really nice look simply by saturating different colors to different levels to create what's called color contrast. Now, this generally does lead to a more dynamic image, as well as those really nice pleasing skin tones. Now, on the topic of color profiles, I did notice the image was a little soft at the box. That said, I found anywhere between 1 to 3 internal sharpness to be ideal, and again, I found you can get a really good looking image. Some of the other smaller things that I like are things like the build quality. This thing is built very well. It's also weather sealed, which is handy in times like this where it's raining. I also like the digital IS. Now, this camera doesn't have any in-body image stabilization, which to a lot of people is a con, but in my experience, the standard digital IS works just as well, if not better, than the IBIS on the GH5. And when you turn on the enhanced image stabilization, yes, there is a bigger crop, but that is seriously smooth. And of course, another thing I enjoy about this camera is the ease of use. Canon cameras have always been extremely easy to use. It's not really a complicated process getting them to work well, but like the shutter speed and that aperture being switched, I am still adjusting to those changes in button layouts. I'm sure in a week it'll be fine though. So yeah, in conclusion, I'm very satisfied with the EOS R so far. It works well for what I like to shoot, checked off every box on my camera wish list, and as I said at the start of this video, I personally think this is my perfect camera. Alright, so that's it for today. As always, thank you for watching. Remember to like the video if you want to see more content like this, and smash that subscribe button. I'm done for now, and I will see you guys in the next one.